the more I've worked with opioids, the more I've realized that the way we use these medications clinically is not most of the time evidence-based, hardly at all.
Welcome to the Brains on Brains podcast, brought to you by ECNP, where early career scientists speak with the most interesting experts in applied and translational neuroscience.
Good morning and welcome to the ECNP podcast series, where we try to dive in very deep into the groundbreaking research and innovation shaping our understanding of neuropsychopharmacology. My name is Chiara Montemitro and I am a member of the ECNP Early Career Board. I'm a psychiatrist and a PhD in neuroscience and neuroimaging, and I'm currently working as a clinical scientist at Linköping University. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor Siri Leknes, a leading expert in social and affective neuroscience at the University of Oslo. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So my first question is about your career, actually the early components of your career. Your journey has been really incredible. And you started with a cognitive PhD, right? A PhD in cognitive neuroscience at Oxford University.
That's right.
And then you moved to more neurophysiological studies with Professor Håkan Olsson and Bruno Lang. So I was very curious to know more about how did you put together all these different pieces of knowledge about neuroscience and neuropsychopharmacology, and also of course, all your mentors were really, really great, but they had very different research aims, probably, and also very different techniques. So was it difficult as a trainee to put together all these pieces and to build up your own knowledge?
Yeah, so I've actually thought a bit about this question. So I was extremely lucky in Oxford to be under the mentorship of Irene Tracy, whose mentorship style was perfectly aligned with my needs. Essentially, she gave me lots of space to figure out what I wanted to do and, encouragement and guidance when I needed it. So leaving Oxford, I was very confident and in retrospect, very naive. I'd sort of really picked up on any of the politics, and I hadn't really also picked up on all of the hardness, I think, in many ways of being a trainee, of like the push to publish, etc. So I did, hit reality pretty hard when I moved to Oslo because my mother was sick. And I initially had a different mentor, which was actually a really difficult experience. And I lost a lot of confidence very quickly. But then I met Håkan Olausson at FEN. We started talking about collaborations, and then he basically bought me out of my contract. But Håkan was doing the neurophysiology, which was a nice reminder coming from a neuroimaging background that, it's not the nervous system extends into the body, because I'd sort of conveniently forgotten about that while scanning people's brains. I don't have the patience to do the neurophysiology myself. So I was still doing neuroimaging, and then I moved more and more into psychopharmacology and drug studies. And that was where I found my happy place. And so I've done eye tracking and oxytocin studies and which was a far cry from my background in pain neuroimaging. But to my mind, it's always been part of the same project, which is to understand how the brain and the body give rise to subjective experience. And it doesn't, I'm not that fussed about what kind of experience we're looking at, because all of these experiences are what makes us human, right?
Wow, it should be, I think, again, your journey was really, looking from outside, it really looks a very long journey, but in a sense also amazing to be able to put together these different pieces and to give a purpose to all of them in such a nice way.
But I think a privilege of being a trainee, it's easy to say that, of course, in retrospect, but a privilege is that you can change topics completely, right?
Yeah.
As long as you have a PhD, you can go and do something different afterwards.
Yes.
And for me, through sort of social and affective neuroscience with opioids, I've come full circle, and I'm now, very interested in pain again, because of the interactions between opioids and pain, and trying to understand how the endogenous opioid system influences both pain and all of these affective and social experiences.
We will go back to that a bit later. But yeah, a suggestion to trainees who are struggling finding, a postdoc, maybe after a PhD. So your suggestion is go and try, even if it looks very different from your background. So
I think that my main piece of advice is go with people who make you feel good about yourself. If the work environment gives you energy, you can deal with any topic. So that would be my the main key, I think, to whatever I've achieved, is that I've just loved working with these mentors and with their colleagues, and the way that they ran, their labs in a very inclusive way. I think that's actually more important than the scientific content.
So actually it's love science and work with people who love science as well.
Yeah, and who are generous and kind.
Yes. So I have something more about your personal insight. So, your career has been marked by a lot of achievements and awards. And you also serve as an associate editor for major journals. And you are the president-elect of the Society for Social Neuroscience.
I've been the president now. I'm towards the end of my term, which I'm grateful for.
But yeah, you were also among the first researchers to publish an annotated CV that candidly includes both your achievements, but also all your setbacks. And you included your personal challenges in this annotated curriculum. And for example, the period around the childbirth of your kids, and also caring for your mother, as you said before. First of all, thank you for sharing that part. It was very helpful as a trainee to read the experience of other people before me. Also, I was curious to know what motivated you to write that annotated CV, and to share this personal experience alongside your professional journey, because it's not something that everyone does. Yeah. So what was your motivation behind that?
Well, I actually wrote the CV because I was doing a sort of a career event for the Affective Science Conference, and it wasn't really going to be a talk. And I thought, what if I just write down the stuff that I would say to somebody if I talked to them? So, we have different styles of communicating in general, right? But I would have, if I had just that one-to-one with you, I would have told you all of those things. Maybe it would have taken too long, but and then I just thought, well, let's just write them down. And then I just published it on my website, and it gathered a lot more attention than I'd anticipated. And it was it was very sort of ironic almost that I got a lot of attention for displaying my sort of my failures. But I've always found it encouraging when other people turn out to be human. Yeah. Because it's easy to read somebody's paper and imbue them with all of these wonderful qualities. And the way that we communicate science in general, when you write your paper, you don't usually write about the 5 pilot studies that didn't work out. But actually, people need to know about those. That's partly why we need to go to a conference, so that we can talk to people and be like, well, why didn't you do this? And they'll say, yeah, we tried it, didn't work. And then you save 6 months to a year of your own life, not having to repeat the same mistake, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's the same kind of logic. If we share our mishaps and also maybe sometimes thoughts on how the system could be improved, then maybe in the long run it will be better. I do feel that having been lucky enough, to have a secure position now in science and, at the university, that I also sort of owe it to pay something back. Because if I don't do it, who's going to do it?
Yeah. Really, thank you for sharing that part with us. Also, as a woman in science, from that annotated CV, it merges a lot, right? That you cared for your children, you cared for your mother, you put together life and science. And in a way, it emerges, I'm interpreting, but I think that what emerges is that science and life communicate,
Yeah.
and they can influence each other.
Yeah.
So was it hard to deal with this interaction between life and science and to realize actually that that interaction really matters? Because very early in your career, probably we are a bit unaware of this interaction and how much they matter.
Yeah, I feel like I look back at my own PhD period as a time when I was extremely lucky because I didn't have a lot of responsibilities in my own life. And I also had this sort of buffering of my supervisors. So I wasn't really aware of all of the responsibilities that would arrive in sort of in work. And I think it's a privilege if you can live through that. But most of your life is sadly. But the nice thing is then the science gets easier as life gets harder, I think. So, and, I'm not implying that the science gets easy, but I do feel that, well, I have a friend who's sort of gone down the sort of Oxbridge system, where you can get these positions that resemble more the life of a classical iconic scientist, where you live in college and you have scouts to do the cleaning for you, and you have 3 meals a day prepared for you. So actually you have no responsibilities. And imagine how much science you could do if somebody took care of everything else. And my friend's saying, well, that's what all of these old guys, that's what they used to have. They had a wife and a staff. And I think, that's the way we've organized society. I don't get a wife and a staff. I'm lucky that I have a husband who really believes in sharing responsibilities. And I'm lucky also that I have a family to care about. But good grief, how much more science I could do if I didn't, right?
Yeah. Life and work balance are very, very hard.
Yeah, so Scandinavia is maybe more friendly towards work-life balance, but of course we have to put up with a horrible climate and depressing winters. So I'm not sure how much the net gain is.
Yeah, I recently moved to Sweden a couple of years ago, so I struggled a lot with the climate, with the weather, especially the darkness. But actually, I really appreciate the work environment and the fact that the society seems to care about people work balance and happiness.
It does help. You do get better at your science if your personal life is also functional, right?
Yes. I have another question about that CV, because you've mentioned, I think in an interview, and I quote you, I've never applied for an award, and I don't really feel that I understand their role in academic careers.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you if you could elaborate on this point, because we are here to talk about reward, pain, addiction, and all these topics strongly related with motivation. So what do you think should be the positive motivators because I think we need some motivators in our careers. So what should be these positive motivators driving researchers in ideal academic environment?
Well, I think we all get into science because we have a passion for knowledge. And I think sometimes we get sidetracked by the incentives that are there, that we start thinking not about finding the answer, but just getting that paper out. And those two aren't the same thing, right? So I think a couple of years ago, I had to support somebody's application. I had to fill in one of these NIH biosketches. And they have a really nice format where you try to find some patterns in your work about, how and their impacts, but in a sort of more concrete way, I think, than we usually do. So you try to create a narrative about what you've actually achieved in terms of the science and not in terms of these, how many papers or anything like that. And I found that, it's really hard, but I found that very inspiring because it sort of pushes you to think back to what really motivates you. Have I actually found out anything at all? And if so, it doesn't matter. But how to change the system that's a big process. I think a lot of people are trying in different ways, right? I think One thing I find really inspiring is when some societies create, like ECNP has a null finding award for preclinical research, which is, I think, immensely important because there still isn't a culture in much of preclinical literature to publish things that didn't work. And everyone needs to know so they don't end up wasting time. And there are also some team awards and also, I think, some mentorship awards that I find sort of, that they shift the focus away from just me, and into, well, what are the things that actually make science better? Mm-hmm. So those are nice.
So my second question on this topic, as an expert in addictions, do you think that academia rewards researchers in a way with an intermittent reward schedule that actually drive science addiction? So do you think we are all addicted to science in a way?
So I guess the definition would then require that we persist despite negative consequences.
We have several negative consequences.
So
we also have a lot of positive ones. But
yeah, I guess every person has to ask themselves the same question, I guess. Is the net gain larger than the negative consequences? And I think when your answer is no, and I think sometimes it will be no, then I guess that's the time to shake things up, maybe move somewhere. We are planning a sabbatical and I am really, really excited about that, as a way of also shaking things up a bit and getting some fresh perspectives.
So let's move a bit more into science. And I'm very glad that you accepted this invitation for this interview because, the opioid epidemics is really growing up out there. So research on opioids, I think it's very important during this time. The first question is, how did you initially get involved with opioids and research in opioids?
Well, so as I trained in pain, opioids were obviously always sort of on the radar. But when I started doing opioid research myself, it was actually mainly to understand reward mechanisms. And I wanted to emulate this approach, I think, initially, I forget. They sometimes do these bi-directional drug manipulations. There was one, I think, at the time, a Nature paper with dopamine. And I thought, that's so elegant, that's so cool, I want to do that. And I wanted to start with a neurochemical system that would be likely to shape experience of reward. And it was pretty much 50-50 opioids or endocannabinoids. But right at that time, when I was writing that grant, rimonabant was removed from storage and it became impossible to get hold of. So then it was opioids. There are plenty of both agonists and antagonists out there, right? So that was how the choice was made.
TBT.
Right, yeah. Partly, except of course, opioids are one of the neurochemicals that you think about when you think, well, what shapes the experience of pain and pleasure? And then I still ask myself sometimes, why am I still doing opioid research? Because I thought we'll just do this one study and then we'll move on to other neurochemical systems. But here we are 10, 15 years later.
But it's still very important as a field. It's really growing. You told us about what motivated you at the very beginning and the fact that you are still ongoing. Right now, I did some research. And one of your current project that is funded by the European Union with the Horizon grant explores how brain and psychological states influence drug effects, right? Mm-hmm. Especially opioid drug effects. And I don't know if you read the recent book that last year the Pulitzer Prize went for narrative, actually went to an opioid book. So to a book about opioid and early stressors in life that actually led to opioid misuse.
Wow, that sounds very cool. No, I haven't read it.
Yeah. And actually it's called Demon Copperhead on the basis of David Copperfield.
Yes.
So there are a lot of really early life stressors. And then, the story of this guy who is going toward, through his addiction. I was wondering, it seems like common knowledge that early stressors can induce habits and especially addictions. But there is not so much research about this correlation. A lot of research is actually focused on the mechanism by which opioids act on our brain or what are the drug effects, but not what makes us more vulnerable, maybe, to these drugs. So I was very curious about how did you, given that it's a bit of an outlier, maybe, project compared to the others about opioids and addictions. So what made you looking at this correlation at the very beginning?
Well, the epidemiology is clear, right? If you've had a lot of stressors, early life or later in life, you are at greater risk of substance use disorder, but also pretty much any other bad thing that can happen to you, right? Chronic pain or depression, anxiety, etc. So, there seems to be some common ground there. I got interested in this notion that perhaps the hypothesis that we tested in this project was that if you experience an opioid during stress, perhaps if you get this experience that I've had myself as a research participant, that you can feel the things happening, but they feel far away from you. So you're almost a bit numb, like it doesn't matter to you anymore. And I thought that could be quite a desirable feeling if you're undergoing a lot of stress. And perhaps that's what drives the repeated use, because you just want a break. So we decided to test this in the lab using acute stress in healthy volunteers. And interestingly, what we find, so we have a preprint out on this, what we find is that the opioids don't actually help. We get people super stressed and we give them intravenous oxycodone and they don't feel any better, which is very contrary to what people with opioid use disorder and even chronic pain patients just treated with opioids, that they will tell you that they really help. But in healthy people without opioid use, that's not what we see. We do, however, see that our male participants, they work really hard to get more opioids afterwards. So we do a self-administration, and our female participants don't. So the opioids don't actually help, but they still want more. Okay. So I think we're looking at a direct motivational effect, and I think those have maybe been overlooked in the literature because opioids change how we feel. We've assumed that the behavioral sort of compulsions are mediated by that, and I think our results suggest quite strongly that's not the case. However, I will also say that somebody who just finished their postdoc in my lab, Molly Carlisle, actually recruited people with severe childhood trauma and a control group with no childhood trauma and gave them morphine in the lab and showed a differential response. We've tried to replicate that in our own surgical opioids data, and we haven't been able to confirm it, but I think my money would still be on this notion that if for a reason such as severe childhood trauma, you are very activated and you do experience a lot of stress, that could drive this response that you sometimes hear in people who develop problems with opioids, that, oh my God, it feels like I'm getting a hug, or, some people say I'm getting a hug from Jesus. That's obviously in the United States. I still think there is a vulnerability there, that you do feel such relief from your sort of hackles getting relieved.
About the effects that you showed in males, are they aware that actually the opioids are not helping them reducing the stress levels?
I don't know. That's a great question. We did debriefing, but of course we didn't. This wasn't what we hypothesized, right? I thought they would want opioids more because they helped. So we didn't.
But we don't know if they.
No, but we do have some measures that we might be able to look into it, because we do actually also ask them, how much better do you feel after this treatment? Yeah. I'll go and take a look. It's a great question.
Because usually we ask, how high did you feel, maybe?
Yes.
But it's hard to then ask them if they really felt something different based on the specific target.
Yeah, why did you want more?
Yeah, why? Because I don't know, but it can be just something motivated by totally different reasons. And
I do sometimes wonder if the questions we ask are not the correct ones also for the chronic pain patients, because sometimes they will say things like the pain is the same, but it just takes the edge off. And if we just ask them for a pain rating, that's not the correct question. And there are some suggestions from Ajay and Harper and some other people that actually what the opioids give you is a sense of relief, but without actually targeting the pain. But we do need to do more research and ask different questions. And maybe work more closely with the patients as well to try and disentangle what are the questions we should be asking.
Working with both pain and addictions. I mean, pain probably now it's improving as a field in terms of stigma, while addiction probably is improving in a slower way.
Possibly, yeah.
But how do you feel about the stigma surrounding both conditions? Because both pain and addictions are usually underrated by clinicians and other people. I mean, of course, we are in a very special bubble here, right? All the clinicians who are here are involved in neuroscience or psychopharmacology, but real life, it's a bit different. There's a lot of stigma.
Yeah, I mean, the mechanisms that cause the pain and addiction, they are invisible to us, right? And I think one of the interesting things of being a parent is realizing how much of what we try to do, when raising our children is just to teach them to pull it together and get it together. And that, of course, is sometimes the attitude with which we meet people suffering from addiction or pain. That's like, well, why don't you just pull yourself together? It's very deeply ingrained in us. But clearly that's not an approach that's helped.
Yeah.
I am really interested in the effects of stigma. I have a colleague in the University Hospital of Lausanne. She's actually formalized the stigma that patients experience into a stress task. Because, the stress task that we've used in our lab is the TRIER, where you do have sort of a fake job interview and then a difficult maths task. But actually, the more self-relevant the stressor is, the better it works. So what she's done is she basically, in the Swiss system, there is a physician whose role it is to interview patients about their right to receive benefits. And these meetings, these interviews are extremely stressful to the patients because they essentially feel disbelieved and they feel the stigma. So she's developed a training interview where this is what they go through. And they get super stressed. And I think it's both powerful. She wants to use it as a tool to help patients learn how to manage stress. But I think it's also a very powerful way of showing clinicians that, look, when you meet patients in this way, it actually harms them. It has a lot of bodily consequences, and we can measure them. They have high cortisol, response, they're sweating, their pulse is up and they feel awful. And I think it would be very interesting to see if we can track these effects as they accumulate over time, to really try to show that you shouldn't just treat people as people to be nice. You should actually do it because as a physician, it's your responsibility to look after their health.
And their condition that is there, even if you cannot see it.
Yes, and you might be worsening that condition by disbelieving them, sadly.
Yes. So we talked a little about this earlier, before we started, about biomarkers of brain disorders. But in your project, you are using a lot of different measures, so both behavioral paradigm, computational modeling, functional neuroimaging. So what is, if you have to choose one, what will be your primary measure of interest and why? So what, in a sense, if we have to pick a marker of a brain condition, in this case, of course, that is opioid-related, which one will be your choice?
So since my fundamental aim is to understand subjective experience and their relation to the brain, I cannot imagine doing a project where I don't ask people how they feel. But acknowledging that how we feel bears sometimes very little relationship with what we choose to do, I think the main measures of importance are how do you feel And, what are your experiences up till this point? And then a behavioral measure, essentially, to try and get at not what they think they're going to do, but what they actually do.
Decision making.
Yeah, and I think these are, so far, they seem to be better at trying, well, they're certainly more relevant for understanding the link between sort of, the brain and subjective experience than any of the brain or blood markers or other physiological markers that we can measure. Sort of having been in the field for 20 years, I've heard people rave about every new thing. This is like, oh, you can read out subjective experience from the pupil, or you can read out pain from, the peripheral neurons or the spinal neurons or the brainstem or the brain. And we are getting better at it, but that's not an approach that I'm personally willing to invest the time to take.
Okay. And I was thinking about, the state of the brain when we measure these markers.
Yeah.
And do you think that, for example, in the context of decision making, for example, we should need, of course, in labs, we have manipulations and we are looking specifically at them, but probably outside our labs, should we look at more time varying parameters, or, for example, decision making, how that varies in life, in real life?
I think the EMA approaches where you just try to understand what's happening while people just go about their lives. I think that's really a powerful direction that will give us a lot of insight also into the dynamics. It's computationally challenging to do, these network analyses, and it's also really annoying when you're a participant in one of these EMA studies because you keep getting these prompts and you're like, I don't want to deal with this now. But I do think, ultimately, what we want to understand is, how things go right or wrong in people's lives. So I think I love doing lab studies. I think they're very powerful. But I am also I'm optimistic about what we can learn from also doing these longitudinal observational studies in individuals to try and understand what drives their decisions in real life.
Mm-hmm. Looking at, your career a lot, as we said, a lot of this is based on opioids and pain. Mm-hmm. And actually, everything started with pleasure and pain, right? And reward.
Yeah.
And I've seen that recently you started a new project about music and reward components.
We've done a little bits of music research with Bruno Lang and a grad student that was working with him, looking at musical chills. And actually, the sabbatical that I'm planning will be in a group that do a lot of music research. So I'm hoping to learn more.
Okay. So it's a sabbatical, but actually to do more science.
Of course. What else are you going to do in your sabbatical? I can't imagine writing a book or something. So but I think the greatest privilege of being a scientist is that, certainly in my job description, I am meant to go away once in a while to go and learn something from somebody. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the best thing ever.
So I have a follow-up question on this statement. So you will never stop learning, and this is amazing. So this is actually one of the best motivators ever to be able to continue to learn and put pieces together to create your own puzzle of what is inside the brain.
Yes, absolutely. And also, we were talking about, I was sort of questioning a bit, why am I still working on opioids? And it's actually, there I have an additional motivation, which is that the more I've worked with opioids, the more I've realized that the way we use these medications clinically is not most of the time evidence-based, hardly at all. And there's another term for it from Jason Bassy's lab. He calls it eminence-based prescribing, where we just follow whoever influential clinician made a statement. And I feel quite passionately about getting the evidence to a state where we can actually say when we use these medications, it is based on evidence and not just on a select piece of evidence that supports what we already think, but actually on the full evidence. And there's a lot of work, which is why, but we are, I did just publish a paper on stimulants and early life stress, and we do,
But I was very impressed by that. I mean, those research showing that actually opioids are not so effective in a lot of, for example, surgical pain, surgery-related pain. And I heard one of you talking about that, and I was really, wow, I didn't know this.
No.
So there are some evidence don't reach us.
It's not that they don't work, it's just that they're not better than the alternatives.
Yes.
And actually, and because they work on so many different subjective feelings, they can relieve your pain by also making you, anxious actually, and nauseous, and and super sedated, and they have so many other effects. Sometimes they prevent people from standing up, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work that remains, but it is. And so I sometimes get this question: is it different for opioids than for other psychiatric medications? And I think that's a very interesting question. And I'm a little bit afraid to dive into these other literatures, because I'm really hoping that they will be based on better evidence than the opioid field is. But I'm not sure that's always going to be the case.
Yeah. Well, and about pleasure again.
Yeah.
So I was very thrilled by the music chills study. And do you see music or other, let's say, pleasure-related manipulation playing a role in treating certain brain conditions, especially certain brain states, for example, related with drug addiction or other dopaminergic states, let's say?
Yeah, I think that is a great question, because a lot of the treatment that we are currently, giving, they actually really focus on this, right? A lot of the sort of the most effective treatments for chronic pain, for instance, what they really do is to try to give the pain less room in the person's life, and replacing that with things that people want to do, like, going to their kids' football game, or going to the gym, or being able to make dinner, whatever it is, like these. And actually, these are the things that give us the greatest pleasure in life. So I think there is a big movement both in the addiction field and in the pain field, although not necessarily aware of each other that much, to try and enrich people's lives as a way of reducing the negative influence of the pain or the addiction. So I think that's very powerful. And I'm sure music can play a big role. And I think it's sort of intuitive, right? We all use music to regulate our emotions and to generate pleasure. I mean, not everyone, but most people do, right? Yeah.
And to boost, for example, activity or performance. We all use music for that reason as well. So probably it is a very powerful tool.
Exactly. And it's a little bit like, in a way, the same way that we use other people, right? To sort of regulate our bodily rhythms and our emotions.
So we are almost out of time, but I would like to ask you, probably if there is anything else that you would like to share with our listeners, especially with very early career investigators and scientists?
Well, I think sort of the philosophy that we have, in my research group and the research groups that I collaborate with, is that it needs to be fun. If it's not fun, then it's not going to be worth it. And I don't think not everyone is that motivated by fun, but I think fun sort of encapsulates both the fact that you work with nice people that are kind and inclusive and generous, and that you get to work on something you're passionate about. And I think I've talked to a lot of young people who don't have that. But some people do amazing, they go through and they have this amazing degree, loads of, real, not just great papers, but real insights generated, but they haven't enjoyed it. And then they just leave science. And And I'm so sad because I feel like, the field has really lost out on a great opportunity because this person just felt all of the pressure and none of the fun. So I think my main advice to sort of people starting out is just, really take a good look at your situation. And if you're not having fun, and maybe, see if you can move, or if there are other things that you can do to change it, to just make sure that the net sum of your activities is positive.
Thank you very much. Probably, I was thinking while you were talking that probably we don't consider mentors and mentee to be humans in that way, right? So we know that humans prefer certain other humans, and there can be just sympathy or, very different ways to look at life and other things. So there can be bad match and good match even in that, and that probably is a human thing, and it's not supposed to alter your career. So maybe another mentor or another mentee can be just a different approach, a different.
Yeah. We do continue learning, but one of my postdoc mentors, Håkan Olausson, he actually said to me at some point, he said, Siri, you know what? I don't think I'm getting any better at this. He's like, I feel like maybe I'm getting worse. And I said, that makes me laugh, but it also, and he just said, every person is so different. You really, there's a limit to how much benefit you get from having done this before. And I think that is an important insight, is that it just needs to be right for you. Yeah. Doesn't matter if it's right for other people or not, right?
Thank you very much. I want to once again thank you for joining us today. We are very excited to know about your sabbatical at this point next year and to see where your research will lead next. To all our listeners, we really hope you enjoyed this exploration of psychopharmacology with Professor Siri Leknes, and we will see each other next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from ECNP. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the interviewee and do not necessarily reflect the official position of ECNP. The content of this podcast should not be used in any way as the basis for treatment decisions.